Welcome to the Missing Dots channel. Today, after visiting Jannat al-Baqi Cemetery, just remembered about Imam Ali ibn al-Qayyim, Zayn al-Abidin al-Sajjad, and all blurred sense about him started coming into my mind.
Yeah, he's such a profoundly complex figure to think about.
He really is. I mean, imagine being 22 years old, right? You're violently ill, burning up with a fever, and you are literally forced to watch as a massive imperial army slaughters every single man in your family.
Right.
And then, the smoke clears, the tents are burned to the ground, and the most powerful empire on earth just turns its eyes to you. You are the sole surviving male heir.
It's an unimaginable position to be in.
Exactly. So, do you fight a hopelessly unwinnable battle and guarantee your own death? Or do you stay silent, risking that history might brand you a coward? You provided us with this incredible stack of sources for us to explore today. We're talking Sunni Hadith sciences, Shia theological texts, and even like modern Marxist critiques and secular historical analyses.
Yeah, it's a massive range of material.
It is. And reading through all of it, one glaring question just jumps right out. How did a man who survived the absolute greatest tragedy in early Islamic history manage to shape the entire trajectory of the faith without ever lifting a sword?
It is a phenomenal question. But before we really start unpacking the history here, I think we need to set a strict ground rule based on all these diverse materials we're looking at.
Okay, what's the rule?
Our goal today is not to take a side. We are not here to endorse the Sunni perspective or the Shia perspective, the secular historical view, or the critical atheist viewpoint.
Right, we're staying totally neutral.
Exactly. If there is politically or sectarian-charged content in these sources, we are just going to impartially lay out those fascinating historical debates. We'll look at the sharpest critiques and the scholarly defenses exactly as they exist in the text. We're really just the guides walking you through this incredibly complex landscape.
I love that approach. We are just putting the ideas on the table for you, the listener, to explore. And to understand everything this man did, we really have to start with the physical reality of that survival.
Yeah, the Battle of Karbala.
Right. The year is 680 CE. Imam Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, alongside his family and a tiny group of companions, is surrounded and completely massacred by the Umayyad Khalif Yazid's massive army.
It was an absolute slaughter.
Every adult male in that camp is killed, except Ali ibn Hussein. And the immediate pushback we see in the secular and critical sources you shared is just blunt. They ask, was his survival just a convenient excuse?
Yeah, the cowardice critique.
Right. The sources say he was sick, but honestly, some critics look at this and ask if this illness was just, a convenient way to avoid the swords. Was it cowardice?
It's a harsh, really cynical question, but it's one that modern historians confront directly. However, the historical consensus across the board, and I mean from the early historian Abu Miknaf all the way to the famous Sunni historian al-Tabari, they all agree he was bedridden with a severe, incapacitating illness.
So we're not just talking about a mild cold.
Oh no, not at all. We are talking about severe fever and dysentery. If you think about the biological reality of a desert siege, surrounded by an army, with the water supply cut off for days.
Oh wow, right, the dehydration alone.
Exactly. Dysentery and catastrophic fever become highly probable. He was physically unable to stand up, let alone, hold a heavy medieval sword or mount a horse.
The thing is, it's actually pretty simple. If your body is failing, you literally can't be a cavalryman.
Precisely. And from the perspective of classical Islamic jurisprudence, this triggers a very specific legal mechanism. It's known as isqat al-taklif bailais.
Okay, break that down for us.
It essentially means that severe physical inability legally exempts a person from religious and moral obligations, and that includes combat. The Prophet himself exempted the severely ill from fighting. You just cannot be morally or legally obligated to do something that violates the laws of physics and human biology.
Right, God doesn't demand the impossible.
Exactly. But how that documented historical fact is interpreted depends entirely on the lens of the historian you're reading.
How so?
Well, for Shia Muslims, this severe illness is viewed as direct divine providence. They look at that biological reality and say, alhamdulillah, the Imamate lineage was preserved by the will of God.
So the sickness was actually a shield?
Yes, the physical illness was the necessary mechanism of divine protection, ensuring that the spiritual authority of the al-Bayt, the Prophet's household, was not extinguished in the sand right then there.
But the secular historians don't see it that way.
No, secular historians don't look for divine intervention. They just see a very common, well-documented battlefield disease that happened to save a VIP's life. But regardless of the lens, the fact remains, He was biologically incapable of fighting.
Okay, so the massacre ends. And this introduces a phase of his life that is almost impossible to comprehend. He is put in heavy chains.
Yeah.
He is paraded with the grieving women and children from Karbala all the way to Kufa and eventually to the royal court in Damascus. And they are literally marching behind the severed heads of his father and brothers, which are raised on spears.
The psychological toll of that is just unimaginable.
It really is. And it brings up a really fascinating dynamic in our sources regarding gender roles. Because he was so sick and heavily guarded as this surviving male prize, he couldn't step up and be the vocal public defender of his family.
That's a crucial observation. In the immediate aftermath, he was politically and physically neutralized. But if he spoke out aggressively in the courts of Kufa or Damascus, the Umayyads would have simply executed him on the spot.
And that would be the end of the lineage.
Exactly.
Which means someone else had to take the spotlight. And that was his aunt, Zainab bint Ali. She is the one who steps into the court of Yazid and delivers these blistering, historically famous sermons.
She completely commanded the room.
Right. And I was reading the feminist and gender critical analyses in our stack, and they ask a very provocative question about this. They ask, did his reliance on a woman marginalize his authority?
It is a brilliant point of discussion in modern academia. Feminist Islamist scholars point out that Imam Zayn al-Abidin collaborated completely with Zainab, and in doing so, he subverted the patriarchal norms of 7th century Arabia.
He didn't try to silence her or speak over her?
Not at all. He recognized and deferred to her female religious and moral authority. There is a very famous incident in the court of the governor Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad in Kufa.
What happened there?
The governor threatens to execute the young, sick imam right there in the court. And it was Zainab who threw her arms around her nephew and explicitly challenged the governor. She basically said, if you kill him, you have to kill me too.
I never thought about it that way. In a society that heavily prioritized male voices and, toxic machismo, you have the surviving male heir relying entirely on his aunt to be the public face of their resistance.
Yeah, and this framework doesn't undermine his leadership at all. It redefines it. It shows a model of authority that prioritizes strategic survival, and it elevates the women in his family as absolute equal partners in the preservation of their legacy. Zainab was the undisputed heroine of the immediate aftermath of Karbala.
That shifts the narrative so completely. But eventually, the captives are released, they return to the city of Medina, and our sources note that for the next 40 years, Imam Zayn al-Abidin wept.
40 years.
The historical accounts say he cried every single time he was served a glass of water, just remembering his father's thirst.
There is a very specific, famous historical anecdote that illustrates the depth of this. He was walking through the marketplace in Medina one day, and he saw a butcher preparing to slaughter a sheep.
Okay.
The imam stopped, approached the butcher, and asked, "Have you given this animal water before you slaughter it?"
And what did the butcher say?
The butcher replied, "Of course, O grandson of the Prophet, it is our law to give the animal water." And upon hearing that, the imam just broke down sobbing. He cried out to the public, "My father was slaughtered hungry and thirsty, denied the water of the Euphrates."
Wow. Just wow. And this is exactly where the atheist and psychological critiques in our sources really sharpen their knives.
Yeah, they did.
To a modern secular reader or, a psychologist looking back, 40 years of that looks like severe pathology. They ask, was this debilitating PTSD? Was he psychologically broken?
Right.
Or worse, from a cynical political view, they ask if he was establishing a cult of victimhood that prioritized emotional dysfunction over rational, productive action.
It's very easy to see how a modern, clinical, or highly cynical political lens might diagnose it exactly that way. But classical scholars and sociologists analyzing the severe political climate of the Umayyad era, they offer a totally different interpretation.
Which is?
This is not a loss of emotional control. This was a highly calculated weeping of resistance.
Explain that, because it sounds like an oxymoron. How on earth is weeping a form of resistance?
You have to look at the environment. Medina was absolutely swarming with Umayyad spies. The state apparatus under rulers like Yazid and later Abd al-Malik was terrifying.
We're a total police state.
Exactly. Any explicit political speech, any call to arms, or any direct cursing of the caliph was classified as treason, and the punishment for that was immediate death. If the imam stood on a soapbox and preached revolution, he would be dead by sunset.
So he couldn't speak. He couldn't rally an army.
But he could cry. By crying publicly in those very specific, highly visible situations, like at the butcher's stall or when water was poured at a public gathering, He forced the public to constantly, viscerally remember the starvation and injustice of Karbala.
It was a loophole.
It was the ultimate loophole. You cannot arrest a man for grieving his murdered father. But every single tear was a silent, devastating indictment of the regime that killed him.
SubhanAllah, it's a masterclass in psychological resilience. He kept the revolution alive in the collective memory of the community without uttering a single treasonous word that would give the Umayyads the legal pretext to execute him.
He transformed a crushing military defeat into an eternal moral victory. He was acting as the living conscience of a traumatized society. He was teaching them how to remember injustice when the state demanded they forget.
But if we follow that logic, right, if his weeping was his silent protest, it naturally leads to the next massive critique from the historical records. And honestly, you, the listener, are probably wondering this right now. Okay, weeping is a great survival tactic for the first few years, but why didn't he eventually fight back?
Yeah, that's the big question.
Years went by, the Umayyad state was brutal. Why not pick up the sword when the time was right?
This is perhaps the most heavily scrutinized aspect of his entire biography, the debate between quietism and rebellion. When he returned to Medina, the Islamic world was bleeding. He lived under some of the most tyrannical rulers in history, specifically Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan and his notoriously ruthless governor, al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf.
And people were fighting back. I mean, you had the Tawabun, the penitents, who marched out of Kufa seeking revenge for Karbala, and they were slaughtered.
Right.
You had Mukhtar al-Thaqafi, who actually managed to seize power in Kufa for a time and hunt down the men who killed Imam Hussein. And decades later, even Zayn al-Abidin's own son, Zayd, would lead an armed rebellion.
Yes, he did.
But Imam Zayn al-Abidin completely refused to join, endorse, or fund any of them. He just stayed in Medina.
He remained entirely aloof from the militant sphere. He retreated deep into scholarship, prayer, and micro-community building.
I have to push back here on behalf of the militant and courageite critiques in our sources, because from their perspective, doesn't doing nothing in the face of tyranny make you complicit?
It's a tough critique.
If you are the spiritual leader, the grandson of the prophet, and you watch tyrants ravaging the Muslim world and you just sit on your prayer mat, isn't that a dereliction of duty?
It is a profound objection, and it actually caused a major theological fracture later on, which we will get to. But to understand his refusal, we have to deeply examine the concept of taqiyya and the raw realpolitik of the 7th century.
Okay, what is taqiyya exactly?
Taqiyya is the religiously sanctioned practice of precautionary dissimulation. It means concealing your true beliefs or pausing outward resistance in times of existential danger to preserve life. It's rooted in the Quranic dispensation for persecuted believers.
So it's not cowardice, it's a sanctioned survival strategy. But what about the real politics side of things?
Well, look at the rebellions you just named. The Tawabin, completely massacred. Mukhtar, eventually defeated, killed, and his movement was fraught with theological deviations that an Orthodox imam could never endorse anyway.
So they were doomed from the start.
Exactly. The Umayyad military machine was a global superpower. We are talking about an empire stretching from North Africa all the way to the borders of India. A few thousand zealous fighters with swords in Kufa were never going to topple that massive infrastructure.
It's like trying to stop a tidal wave with a wooden shield. It might look heroic for 5 seconds, but you are absolutely going to drown.
That is the perfect analogy. His quietism wasn't apathy. It was a cold, highly calculated assessment of reality.
Yeah.
If he joined those doomed rebellions, the Umayyads would finally have the excuse they needed to wipe out the remaining al-Bayt.
They were just waiting for a reason.
They were. By staying out of the military sphere, he guaranteed the physical survival of his family and the preservation of the esoteric, authentic knowledge of the Prophet's household.
But the critics in our secular sources don't stop at his refusal to fight. They point to actions that look uncomfortably close to actual collaboration with the enemy.
The allegiance.
Yes, the controversy of allegiance. After the Umayyad army brutally sacked the city of Medina during the Battle of Al-Hara, and they killed thousands, they looted the city. The records show Imam Zayn al-Abidin gave Bay'ah, a formal pledge of allegiance to the Caliph Yazid.
Yeah.
And on top of that, he accepted state stipends from the Umayyad treasury.
I know, to an outside observer, just reading a summary, that looks devastating.
Honestly, it looks like selling out. How do scholars defend giving a pledge to the very man who ordered the slaughter of your father and then turning around and taking his money?
Classical Islamic scholars deconstruct this using the strict parameters of Islamic law. A pledge of allegiance is a contract. A contract signed under the immediate threat of death, which this absolutely was, as the Umayyad general Muslim ibn Uqba was systematically executing anyone in Medina who refused, is legally void.
It's extortion under the edge of a sword. No medieval or modern court views that as a binding moral oath.
Precisely. It was an act of taqiyya designed solely to save the lives of his dependents, including all the widows and orphans of Karbala who completely relied on him.
That makes sense for the pledge. But what about the money?
Right, the state stipends, the ata. This was an economic system established early in the caliphate where funds were distributed from the public treasury based on tribal lineage and relation to the prophet. It wasn't a bribe, it was public money he was legally entitled to.
But still, taking it from Yazid.
If he refused it, it would have drawn fatal suspicion. It would be a massive red flag to the Umayyads that he was silently rebelling.
Okay, so he takes the Umayyad money to stay off the radar. But what did he actually do with it?
That is the key, right there. He didn't build estates or hoard gold. The historical sources are unanimous that his personal life was one of extreme austerity.
So where did the money go?
He took those state resources, funneled them quietly into his own household, and then redistributed them secretly to the poorest, most marginalized families in Medina.
The very people the Umayyads were crushing.
Exactly. He effectively used the tyrant's treasury to fund a shadow welfare system.
Wow. So the ultimate verdict on this period of quietism is that he was incredibly active, just entirely underground.
Yes.
If the Umayyads had a monopoly on physical violence and political speech, what domain was left for him? How do you fight back when you're legally forbidden to speak to the people?
You speak to God.
You speak to God where the
Okay.
spies can't arrest you. And that brings us to the Sahifa as-Sajariya.
Often referred to as the Psalms of Islam. It is a text containing 54 incredibly dense, eloquent, and profound supplications. It is arguably his greatest enduring weapon.
But applying the critical lens from our sources, there is a massive debate about its authenticity. I was reading the arguments from critical hadith scholars and ex-Muslim historians, and they argue that the earliest complete chains of transmission for this compiled book don't appear until centuries later.
Right.
They ask a very fair academic question. Could this entire text be a 2nd or 3rd century forgery projected backward onto him?
It is the standard historical critical question applied to any ancient religious text. However, major linguists and prominent Western academics like William Chittick, who famously translated it, and Eaton Kohlberg, have done exhaustive philological analysis on the Sahifa.
And what did they find?
What they found is that its syntax, its vocabulary, and its rhetorical structure are completely archaic. They firmly belong to the late 7th and early 8th century. It does not read like Arabic from the Abbasid era centuries later.
So linguistically, the fingerprints match the 1st century of Islam.
Yes. But beyond linguistics, there is a fascinating theological proof of its early authenticity.
I'm listening.
In the 9th and 10th centuries, later Shia theology developed very explicit, systematized sectarian dogmas regarding the Imamate. If a later scholar were forging the Sahifa as political propaganda, you would expect it to be absolutely packed with explicit, heavily sectarian theology to prove their political points against the Sunnis.
Oh, that makes total sense. If I'm forging a document to prove my faction is right, I'm going to make sure the ancient text explicitly says my faction is right.
Exactly. But the Sahifa almost entirely lacks those later, rigid sectarian dogmas. It focuses profoundly on the individual's raw relationship with God, cosmic awe, and ethical living.
So the lack of propaganda is the proof.
Paradoxically, yes. The absence of later sectarian talking points is the strongest proof of its authentic early origin. It captures the pure, undivided spirituality of the 1st century.
But even if we accept it was written by him, the rationalist and atheist critiques in our stack heavily scrutinize the content itself.
Well, they do.
Because the text contains prayers for rain, prayers for physical health, prayers to repel enemies. A rationalist reads this and says, this is just magical manipulation. You are treating God like a vending machine. Put in a prayer, pull the lever, get a rainstorm.
And addressing that critique requires us to dive deeply into classical Islamic theology, particularly looking at frameworks later articulated by scholars like Al-Ghazali. The rationalist critique conflates prayer with magic.
How are they different?
Magic, in the ancient and medieval mind, assumes a mechanical universe where performing a specific ritual coerces nature or the divine to produce a specific outcome. Magic is fundamentally arrogant. It commands.
Right. You say the magic words, and the universe has no choice but to obey.
But Islamic prayer, dua, is the exact opposite of that mechanism. It is an acknowledgement of total human vulnerability and dependence on a free, sovereign, divine will. When Imam Zayn al-Abidin prays for rain, he isn't casting a spell. He is acknowledging that natural processes are continuous acts of God's free will. It's voluntarism.
He is asking a free agent for a favor, fully knowing the answer might be no.
Exactly. If you actually read the prayers in the Sahifa, they are overwhelmingly humble. They constantly include phrasing that acknowledges God may refuse the request out of his infinite unknowable wisdom. That built-in conditionality makes it structurally incompatible with magical coercion.
Okay, but that brings up another apparent contradiction from our sources. We just talked about his austerity. If he was so detached from the material world, why is he praying for material things?
It's a fair question.
Why ask for health, wealth, and good provision? Isn't that contradictory for an ascetic?
It seems like a contradiction until you understand the true Islamic definition of zuhd, or asceticism. Western concepts of monasticism often blur the lines here, equating asceticism with living in a cave, wearing rags, and starving yourself.
Right, the trope of the monk on the mountain.
But in Islam, zuhd isn't destitution, it is non-attachment. The classical scholars define it beautifully. Zuhd is having the world in your hand, but not in your heart.
I love that. The world is in your hand, not your heart. So if you lose it, it doesn't break you.
Precisely. You can ask God for health, for resources, and for provision, so that you have the physical strength and the financial capital to worship effectively and to help others. You cannot feed the poor if you are starving yourself.
You can't pour from an empty cup.
Exactly. You cannot buy the freedom of slaves if you have refused all wealth. Zayn al-Abidin petitioned for worldly well-being, not to hoard it for his ego, but to utilize it as a tool for societal intervention.
Which transitions perfectly into how those prayers turn into a massive social framework. He didn't just whisper in the dark, he built an ethical architecture for his community. And the crown jewel of this is the Risalat al-Huquq, the treatise on rights.
It is a phenomenal text. We're talking about a proto-human rights document from the late 7th century that details the rights of the body, the soul, and society over the individual.
It's incredible.
It maps out of the right of your ear, your eye, your stomach, your neighbor, your teacher, even the right of your adversary in a lawsuit.
It is so meticulously comprehensive, and I was contrasting this in my notes with his grandfather, Imam Ali.
That's an interesting comparison.
Right. We know Imam Ali's famous sermons in the Nahj al-Balagha, but Imam Ali was a head of state. When he spoke, he was talking about macroeconomic governance, taxation, leading armies, running an empire. It was macro ethics.
Right, statecraft.
But Imam Zayn al-Abidin is the leader of a persecuted minority living under surveillance. He couldn't preach about running an empire, so he focused on microethics to save the individual soul.
That is an excellent framework. When you are entirely stripped of macro-political power, you build power at the micro level. You build highly resilient individuals.
From the ground up.
Yes. If you can teach a community how to fiercely govern their own bodies, their own tongues, and their own households with impeccable ethics, you are making them immune to the moral corruption of the state. It is a bottom-up approach to societal reform when the top-down approach is completely blocked by tyranny.
But did this microethics actually translate into real-world action? Because our sources highlight incredible stories of his charity. We touched on the Umayyad stipends earlier, but the specific stories are amazing.
They really are.
The reports say he carried heavy bags of flour and bread on his back in the dead of night to secretly feed up to 100 families in Medina.
Yes, and the secrecy was the most important part of the act. He would cover his face so that the recipients wouldn't feel the shame of knowing who their benefactor was, and so he wouldn't gain any public political clout from it. It was purely for God.
He didn't want the credit.
Not at all. The historical accounts state this was only fully discovered when they were washing his body for burial after his death. The washers found thick, dark calluses embedded in his back from carrying those heavy sacks for decades.
It's an incredibly moving historical detail, but we have to look at the Marxist critique in our stack.
Let's hear it.
A Marxist historian looks at that story and says, okay, carrying flour at night is noble, but doesn't this charity just mask systemic inequality? Isn't he just putting a Band-Aid on a broken system, making himself feel righteous while the Umayyad economic engine keeps grinding people into poverty?
A Marxist critique fundamentally demands the systemic overthrow of the means of production. But we have to counter that by anchoring ourselves in his historical reality.
Right, he wasn't exactly in charge.
Altering the macroeconomic system of the Umayyad Empire was literally impossible for him. He did not control the treasury, the mint, or the taxation system. What he did control was his personal wealth and his immediate household. And fulfilling the ethical obligation to the poor in his immediate vicinity was his divine duty, not a band-aid.
He was operating within the absolute limits of his reality.
Exactly. But furthermore, he did engage in systemic reform where he could, specifically regarding the institution of slavery. He recognized he couldn't abolish slavery across the empire, so he dismantled it locally from the inside out.
How exactly did he do that? Because human trafficking was the backbone of the ancient economy.
He used his wealth to legally purchase and emancipate slaves continuously. But he didn't just buy them and turn them out into the street with nothing. He created an emancipation pipeline.
How did that work?
He would purchase enslaved people, bring them into his household, and over the course of a year, he would educate them. He taught them Islamic jurisprudence, ethics, and literacy. And then, usually around Eid, he would formally emancipate them, often giving them capital to start their own businesses or lives.
That is staggering. He was running a one-man underground university and emancipation network.
Yeah.
He wasn't just freeing bodies, he was injecting highly educated, morally grounded free citizens into the Medinan economy.
Exactly. He weaponized his microethics to subtly alter the demographic and intellectual makeup of the city.
Speaking of demographics, we have to talk about his own household because there are intense family myths and historical realities in our sources. Let's start with his mother, Sherbanu.
Ah, yes. The very famous historical narrative that she was a Sassanid Persian princess, the daughter of the last Persian emperor Yazdegerd III, who was brought to Medina as a captive and married to Imam Hussein.
The secular historians in our sources are deeply skeptical of this. They view it as a much later fabrication designed to conveniently merge Arab Islamic religious authority with ancient Persian royal legitimacy.
A political tool.
Right. A political tool to make Shia Islam more palatable to the newly conquered Persian masses.
It is a very strong academic critique. When you look at the earliest primary sources, they are highly contradictory about her name, her origin, and how she arrived. Some early texts simply refer to her as a freed slave from the region of Sind.
But here's the fascinating thing. Regardless of her actual identity, even if she was a freed slave from Sind rather than a Persian princess, from a core Islamic perspective, it doesn't diminish Imam Zayn al-Abidin at all.
Not in the slightest.
Islam fundamentally teaches that piety outranks lineage. The Prophet Muhammad explicitly stated in his farewell sermon that no Arab is superior to a non-Arab, except in piety and good action. So whether his mother was royalty or a slave, his moral authority remains entirely untouched.
That is exactly right. His nobility was rooted in his taqwa, his deep God consciousness, and his massive intellectual merit, not just aristocratic bloodlines.
And looking at his own family building, the sources note he had around 15 children. Some skeptical critics point to this and say, wait a minute, for a man who spent 40 years weeping, who was incredibly ascetic and detached from the world, having 15 children seems contradictory. Was he truly that consumed by grief?
This critique reveals a deep misunderstanding of Islamic grief and the concept of sunnah. In Islam, extreme monastic celibacy is not a virtue. Marriage and raising children is a highly encouraged sunnah of the Prophet.
Right.
But more specifically for Zayn al-Abidin, we have to remember the context of Karbala. The biological lineage of the al-Abayt was almost entirely decimated. Having a large family wasn't an indulgence. It was a deliberate, vital act to literally rebuild the biological lineage of the Prophet's household from the absolute brink of extinction.
It was an act of survival. You try to wipe us off the map in the desert, so we are going to repopulate, rebuild, and thrive in Medina. It is demographic resistance alongside spiritual resistance.
Precisely. And because he was so successful at rebuilding that lineage and laying this massive intellectual foundation over those decades, we arrive at the later phase of his historical impact, his fractured legacy.
What do you mean by fractured?
Multiple factions, sects, and scholars eventually vied to claim his immense legacy as their own.
And this is where we have to maintain our strict impartiality and just report on how different major groups view him today based on our documents. Let's start with the Sunni perspective.
In Sunni scholarship, Imam Zayn al-Abidin is universally revered as one of the absolute Tabi'in Morozes, the prestigious generation of Muslims that directly followed the companions of the Prophet.
So they hold him in very high regard.
Oh, immensely. They view him as a premier jurist, an ascetic par excellence, and an impeccably reliable hadith transmitter. Over 1,500 hadiths are transmitted through his chains in major Sunni collections.
So he is foundational to Sunni intellectual architecture. And our sources also note he engaged with the Umayyad elite by befriending prominent Sunni scholars like al-Ziri.
Yes, al-Ziri was a highly influential court scholar for the Umayyads. By befriending and intellectually mentoring al-Ziri, Zayn al-Abidin utilized incredible soft power.
He had an inside man.
Through al-Ziri, the Imam's ethical teachings and hadith transmissions reached courts and populations that would normally never listen to a direct descendant of Ali.
It's the ultimate inside game. Now, what about the Shia perspective?
Twelver Shias revere him as the fourth divinely appointed infallible Imam or Masum. They believe he possessed divinely granted esoteric knowledge and was completely protected by God from sin and error.
I have to pause here because I saw this explicitly in the toughest questions from our theological sources. The pushback is obvious.
Let's hear it.
If he is completely infallible to Shias, why does he constantly apologize for his sins in Sahifa al-Sajadiyah? The prayers are overflowing with him weeping over his transgressions, his massive faults, and begging God for forgiveness. How do Shia theologians reconcile the doctrine of infallibility with a man constantly admitting he is a sinner in his own book?
It is a very sophisticated theological paradox. Shia scholars resolve this through a concept known as tark al-aula, which translates to choosing the better of two good options or abandoning the absolute optimum.
Break that down for us.
For an infallible imam, their baseline level of spiritual consciousness is so unimaginably high that a sin is not a legal or moral transgression like stealing, lying, or harming someone. It is simply a momentary lapse in absolute 100% focused presence with the divine.
Wait, let me make sure I understand this. So if I am praying and I get momentarily distracted by, I don't know, a beautiful sunset, to me that's just normal human distraction.
Right.
But to an imam, because their standard of connection to God is absolute perfection, that tiny distraction feels like a massive ontological sin.
Exactly. It's the theological principle that the good deeds of the righteous are the sins of the near ones. The standard is relative to the spiritual rank.
That makes a lot of sense.
Furthermore, Shia scholars argue he was purposefully using these intense prayers of repentance as a pedagogical tool for the wider ummah.
A teaching tool.
Yes, he was demonstrating how to repent. He was acting as the ultimate model of humility before God, teaching the community the posture of a servant, rather than claiming an arrogant, untouchable perfection.
Okay, that makes deep theological sense within that specific framework. But his legacy wasn't just debated between Sunnis and Twelver Shias. There was a massive internal fracture right within his own family after he passed. The Zaydi split.
Yes. After his death, the community of his followers fractured. The Zaydis followed his son, Zayd ibn Ali, who was a fiery activist.
A completely different approach.
Entirely. Zayd firmly believed that a true imam must publicly take up the sword against tyranny to claim legitimate leadership. And Zayd eventually did just that, leading a massive armed rebellion against the Umayyads.
While the Twelver Shias followed his other son, Muhammad al-Baqir, who continued his father's quietist, highly scholarly, and pedagogical approach.
Exactly. It was a fundamental split over methodology, the sword versus the pen. But what historical analysts find so fascinating is that Zayn al-Abidin's quiet, meticulous intellectual infrastructure over 74 years is the only thing that allowed Zayd's later militant movement to even have a theological and social basis.
He preserved the raw material.
Yes, he preserved the raw material of the al-Bayt that both of his sons utilized in entirely different ways.
He laid the foundation, and his sons built different houses on it, which brings us inevitably to the end of his life. The historical consensus among Alid biographers is that he did not die of natural causes.
No, he didn't.
In the year 713 CE, he was poisoned by the Umayyad Caliph al-Walid the Purest. And the obvious question that jumps out of the history books is, why? Why assassinate a quiet man who spent his days praying, freeing slaves, and feeding the poor?
Right, he seemed harmless to this day.
Exactly. He had explicitly refused to join any armed rebellion for over 3 decades. If he wasn't a military threat, why bother killing him?
Because eventually, the Umayyad state realized that his soft power and his immense, unassailable moral authority had become far more dangerous to their regime than any armed rebellion ever could be.
How so?
An armed rebel can be crushed on a battlefield, labeled a traitor, and paraded in chains. But a saintly figure who holds the absolute moral high ground, whose micro-ethics are transforming the population from the bottom up, he delegitimizes a corrupt state simply by existing.
Wow.
His 40 years of silence and weeping were louder than any battle cry. The Umayyads realized that this quiet intellectual revolution was slowly hollowing out their entire ideological foundation.
You can crush an army, but you can't fight a saint. So they poisoned him. When we look at the ultimate verdict of all these historians, secular critics, and theologians on Imam Zayn al-Abidin, we have to answer the core question we started with. Did his political quietism dent Islam with passivity, or did it save it?
Right, the final verdict.
Looking at this massive stack of research, the academic consensus is incredibly clear. The Umayyads tried with all their might to turn the faith into a purely secular, imperial Arab dynasty. They had the armies, the treasury, the swords, and the propaganda.
But by intentionally stepping out of the violent political arena, by focusing relentlessly on the microethics of the soul, by writing the treatise on rights, and by whispering those profound prayers in the dark, Imam Zayn al-Abidin saved the absolute, uncorrupted essence of the religion.
He really did.
He ensured that the spiritual and ethical core of Islam survived its most brutal and corrupt era.
It is an unbelievable legacy of resilience, and I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day. We live in a modern world that is utterly obsessed with instant action. We constantly demand visible productivity. Our culture rewards loud outrage, hot takes, and immediate confrontation.
We do.
But looking at the life of Imam al-Sajjad, what can we learn from a man whose greatest, most enduring revolution was fought entirely through patience, through channeled grief, and through whispered prayers in the dark? Sometimes the most powerful and revolutionary thing you can do is simply survive, remember, and teach. May Allah grant us success. Come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.